The corner office on the 42nd floor of Seattle's newest glass tower belonged to someone who'd learned to measure worth in contracts signed and competitors crushed. Sophia Castellano stood at floor-to-ceiling windows at 6:00 a.m., watching dawn break over Elliott Bay, her reflection showing a woman who'd weaponized perfection until it became indistinguishable from her actual personality. 29 years old, youngest female CEO in the aerospace industry, according to Forbes, which had profiled her last year with the kind of clinical admiration usually reserved for surgical instruments, sharp, efficient, capable of cutting through resistance with minimal waste. The article had called her the Ice Queen of Seattle, and Sophia had framed it because the nickname was accurate and accuracy deserved recognition. Her tailored Armani suit cost more than most people earned in a month, black fabric cut with architectural precision that made her look like she'd been designed rather than dressed. Dark hair pulled into a bun so tight it gave her migraines by noon, but migraines were acceptable cost for the appearance of absolute control. Heels that added 3 inches and clicked like a judge's gavel on Italian marble, each step announcing that Sophia Castellano had arrived and expected your full attention. The office itself was a monument to minimalist achievement, glass desk that seemed to float leather chairs that cost $5,000 each, abstract art on the walls that Sophia had purchased, because her decorators said it conveyed power without warmth. The city sprawled beneath her like a circuit board of illuminated possibilities, and from this height, individual people were invisible, which was exactly how Sophia preferred to think about humanity in general. Castellano Aviation Systems occupied floors 38 through 42 of the building, 400 employees spread across engineering, manufacturing, sales, and administration. Her father, Victor, had built the company from a single hangar operation in 1987, turning government contracts and private aviation deals into a mid-size aerospace firm worth $400 million. He'd semi-retired 18 months ago after a minor heart attack convinced him that 71 was too old to maintain the killing pace that had built his empire. Sophia had been waiting for that retirement since she was 14 and understood that her father's company was her inheritance if she proved herself worthy. 29 years of preparation, business degree from Stanford, MBA from Wharton, 5 years working her way up from junior analyst to VP of operations before Victor finally acknowledged that his daughter might actually be capable of running what he'd built. The board had been skeptical. A woman barely 30 running a company that built aircraft components for military and commercial clients, competing against firms run by men with decades of experience and Rolodexes full of Pentagon contacts. But Sophia had proven them wrong through competence that bordered on obsession, working 16-hour days and making decisions with mathematical precision that maximized shareholder value while minimizing emotional interference. Her personal life was equally controlled. She lived in a waterfront condo in Belltown, 2 bedrooms she didn't need because she had no intention of sharing space with anyone who might require emotional investment. She dated occasionally successful men from compatible industries who understood that dinner meant networking and sex meant stress relief rather than relationship progression. None of them lasted longer than 3 months because Sophia had learned that emotional attachment was liability rather than asset. That lesson had cost her an engagement ring and a wedding venue deposit. Brandon Mitchell had been everything Sophia thought she wanted at 26, successful corporate attorney, Harvard Law graduate, charming in the specific way that men were charming when they wanted something from you. They dated for 14 months, gotten engaged at a restaurant where the ring was delivered on a dessert plate with chocolate sauce spelling out "Marry Me," and started planning a wedding that would have seated 300 guests at the Four Seasons. Then Victor had his heart attack. Emergency bypass surgery, 3 weeks in ICU, doctors telling Sophia that her father might not survive, and if he did, he wouldn't be returning to active management of the company he'd built from nothing. The board had called an emergency meeting. Sophia had walked into that conference room as VP of operations and walked out as acting CEO, youngest person to ever hold the position at Castellano Aviation. Brandon had congratulated her over champagne that night. 2 weeks later, he told her he couldn't marry her because he wasn't interested in being Mr. Castellano wasn't willing to live in her shadow, needed a wife who would prioritize him over her career. The conversation had taken place in her office after hours, and Sophia remembered the way his voice had carried that particular tone of masculine resentment dressed up as reasonable concern. She'd looked at him across her glass desk and felt nothing except calculation about how to minimize the social embarrassment of calling off a wedding with 3 months' notice. Had told him to leave. Had called the wedding planner the next morning and canceled everything. Had never cried about it because crying suggested that Brandon Mitchell mattered and men who left when you needed them most didn't deserve tears. What they deserved was to be erased from your memory and replaced with a principle: never let anyone close enough to hurt you. Never prioritize emotion over strategy. Never let attachment become vulnerability that someone else could exploit. Sophia had built walls after Brandon left psychological architecture that kept her safe from future betrayal. She dated but didn't commit, networked but didn't befriend, led her company with efficiency that made her respected and feared but never loved because love was currency she'd stopped accepting after learning that people traded it for power when the exchange rate favored them. 18 months as CEO had vindicated her approach. Revenue up 22%, stock price climbing steadily, 2 major contracts signed with commercial aviation firms, and now the TechWing aviation deal, $12 million over 3 years, supplying advanced avionics components for their private fleet modernization. The contract sat on her desk in leather portfolio, every clause negotiated over 6 months of meetings with TechWing executives who were old-school traditionalists. They wanted face-to-face negotiations, handshakes that meant something, the kind of personal relationship building that Sophia despised but had mastered because business required performance of warmth even when warmth was theater you staged to close deals. Final signing was scheduled for 10:30 a.m. at TechWing's headquarters across Seattle. The helicopter Bell 407 Castellanos Executive Transport was supposed to be her solution to morning traffic that could turn a 30-minute drive into a 2-hour nightmare. Her pilot, James Anderson, had confirmed yesterday afternoon 9:00 a.m. departure from the rooftop helipad 12-minute flight, plenty of time to arrive composed and confident. Sophia's phone buzzed at 6:47 a.m. with email from her assistant, Kevin Ross, subject line reading, "Urgent, pilot issue." She opened it with stomach already sinking because urgent at 6:47 a.m. meant something had broken in her carefully constructed schedule. Mr. Anderson was in car accident this morning. Broken wrist. Can't fly. I'm working on alternatives but wanted you to know immediately. Sophia stared at the email for 3 seconds, then picked up her phone and called Kevin directly. He answered on the first ring voice, carrying the nervous energy of someone who knew they were delivering bad news to a boss who didn't tolerate problems without solutions. Kevin's words came fast. I've already called 4 charter services. 2 are fully booked, 1 can't mobilize in time, and the 4th wants $4,500 for emergency deployment. Pay it. They still can't get here before 9:30. You'd be cutting it too close. Sophia's mind ran through alternatives with the speed that had made her successful. Driving meant arriving late or leaving now and sitting in traffic, both unacceptable. Rescheduling meant showing weakness to TechWing executives who were already skeptical about doing business with a female CEO young enough to be their daughter. Missing the meeting entirely meant losing a contract that represented 15% of Castellanos' projected annual revenue. Keep calling. I'll be up on the roof by 8:30. Find me a pilot who can fly a Bell 407 by 9 a.m. or start planning how we're going to explain to the board why we lost the TechWing contract. She hung up before Kevin could respond, the kind of abrupt termination that made her employees nervous, but also made them work faster because disappointing Sophia Castellano had professional consequences that people learned to avoid. The next 90 minutes passed in rising frustration that Sophia channeled into productive work, reviewing the TechWing contract one final time, checking stock prices, responding to emails from board members who wanted updates on quarterly projections. At 8:15 a.m., she received another text from Kevin. Backup pilot is in Vancouver for family emergency. Third option has suspended license. Charter service number 5 says maybe by 9:45, but can't guarantee. I'm still calling. Sophia stood and walked to her office windows, looking down at Seattle waking up beneath her. The city was beautiful from this height, all clean lines and geometry, no visible poverty or failure or mess that accumulated at ground level. From 42 floors up, everything looked manageable. But at ground level, Sophia knew chaos was inevitable. Traffic snarled. Accidents happened. Pilots broke their wrists and destroyed carefully laid plans that had required 6 months of negotiation to construct. At 8:47 a.m., Sophia took the elevator to the 42nd floor's rooftop access. The helipad was a circle of painted concrete surrounded by safety rails, the Bell 407 sitting in the center like expensive sculpture that served no purpose because the artist was in the hospital with a fractured bone. Jennifer Blake was already there, Sophia's senior assistant, who'd been with Castellano Aviation for 12 years, and who treated Sophia with the kind of professional respect that barely masked generational disapproval. 45 years old, efficient, subtly judgmental about Sophia's age and gender and management style, Jennifer represented the old guard that thought Victor should have hired a seasoned male executive instead of promoting his daughter. Kevin Ross stood beside Jennifer, 28 years old and perpetually nervous, the kind of logistics coordinator who was excellent at details but terrible under pressure. His tablet showed a list of names with red X marks beside each one, the visual representation of every failed option they'd exhausted in the past 2 hours. Jennifer's voice carried that particular tone of controlled exasperation. "We're out of options, Sophia. We'll have to drive." Well, the suggestion was reasonable, which made it more irritating because Sophia had already calculated that driving meant arriving late and late meant losing the psychological advantage that came from being precisely on time to meetings where power dynamics mattered. "We'll never make it." Kevin's face was pale sweat visible on his forehead despite the cool October morning. "Maybe we can reschedule. I could call TechWing and explain that we had mechanical issues." Sophia's voice cut through his suggestion with surgical precision. "TechWing doesn't reschedule. If we're not there at 10:30, they'll assume we're not serious about the partnership. They'll sign with North Star Aviation instead, and we'll lose a $12 million contract because our pilot wasn't careful enough to avoid car accidents." The words were unfair, and Sophia knew it, but fairness was luxury she couldn't afford when her company's quarterly numbers depended on deals that required exact timing and flawless execution. Kevin flinched but said nothing, just kept scrolling through his tablet, looking for a miracle that didn't exist in any database. Jennifer checked her phone one more time. "Last charter service says they can't mobilize before 9:45 at the earliest. Even if they did, you'd be pushing it." The rooftop fell silent except for the sounds of Seattle waking up 42 floors below traffic noise and construction and the general mechanical hum that big cities produced constantly. The Bell 407 sat waiting, fuel tank full, rotors still, $3 million of advanced aviation technology rendered completely useless by the absence of a single certified pilot. Sophia stood staring at the helicopter and feeling the particular frustration that came from being trapped by circumstances beyond her control. She'd built her entire career on the principle that control was achievable through preparation and competence, that if you worked hard enough and planned carefully enough, you could engineer success regardless of obstacles. But standing on a rooftop at 9:03 a.m. with no pilot and a meeting that would determine whether Castellano Aviation hit its revenue targets, Sophia was confronting the limits of control in a universe that didn't care about her planning or her competence or her desperate need to prove that she deserved the position her father had given her. The stairwell door opened and a man in a gray maintenance uniform stepped onto the rooftop carrying a bucket and mop. Sophia barely registered his presence because maintenance staff were background noise, invisible people who cleaned up after executives and kept buildings functional without requiring acknowledgement or attention. The man paused near the edge of the helipad, looking at the Bell 407 with expression that Sophia couldn't read from where she stood 20 feet away. Then he set down his cleaning supplies and walked toward them with steady purpose that suggested he had reason to be approaching instead of staying invisible the way maintenance staff usually did. Jennifer noticed him first, her expression shifting from professional concern to confusion to something approaching disdain as she registered the gray uniform and the mop he'd left behind. The man stopped a few feet away from Sophia. Up close, he looked to be early 30s, tall and lean, with short brown hair and tired eyes that suggested he worked nights or didn't sleep well, or both. His uniform had Castellano Aviation Maintenance embroidered on the chest, and his hands showed the kind of calluses that came from manual labor rather than office work. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but clear, carrying none of the deference that maintenance staff usually showed when addressing executives. "I can fly it." The words hung in the morning air for a moment that stretched longer than it should have because everyone on the rooftop was processing the absurdity of what they'd just heard. A janitor, claiming he could fly a Bell 407 helicopter. The kind of claim that was either delusional or desperate, or some combination that made it funny rather than serious. Jennifer Blake laughed first, not a polite chuckle meant to diffuse awkward moment. A loud, condescending laugh that carried genuine amusement at the ridiculousness of the situation. Her voice dripped with mockery when she finally spoke. "Excuse me, you think you can fly a helicopter?" The man didn't react, didn't show embarrassment or anger or any of the emotions that people usually displayed when being laughed at by someone who clearly thought they were beneath consideration. He just stood there with hands at his seats waiting. Kevin joined the laughter, nervously glancing between the janitor and Sophia like he wasn't sure whether this was a situation that required security intervention or just awkward moment they could all ignore. Jennifer's smile was cruel in the specific way that powerful people smiled when they encountered powerless people who'd overstepped boundaries. "You seriously think what that flying a helicopter is like playing a video game? That's a Bell 407, multi-million-dollar aircraft. You're a. She paused, looking him up and down with exaggerated assessment. "What are you again? Janitor custodian, someone who mops floors for minimum wage." The man's expression didn't change. "Janitor. And yes, I can fly it." Sophia turned fully to look at him for the first time, really look at him, instead of just registering his presence as background noise. She took in the uniform that had seen better days, the work boots that were scuffed and worn, the hands that were calloused in ways that suggested years of physical labor. His posture was straight, but not military calm, but not cocky, and his eyes met hers without the nervousness that most employees showed when addressing the CEO directly. Something about the way he'd said it, the complete absence of bravado, the quiet certainty that didn't require defending itself, made Sophia pause. She'd spent 18 months reading people in boardrooms, learning to identify bluffs in confidence and desperation, and this man's claim didn't read like any of those things. It read like simple statement of fact delivered by someone who had no reason to lie and no particular investment in whether she believed him. But that was insane. Janitors didn't know how to fly helicopters. People with helicopter licenses didn't work maintenance jobs for $15 an hour. And even if, by some miracle, this man actually had aviation training, letting him fly Castellano's executive transport based on nothing but his word would be liability, nightmare that would make the board question her judgment for the rest of her tenure as CEO. Sophia stepped closer, folding her arms, voice cold and sharp, in the way that had earned her the Ice Queen nickname from employees who thought she couldn't hear them gossiping in break rooms. "You're telling me you can fly a Bell 407 helicopter, operate a $3 million aircraft that requires certification and insurance, and about 10,000 hours of flight experience to handle competently?" The man nodded once. "Yes, ma'am." Jennifer scoffed, her voice rising with indignation that seemed genuinely offended by the audacity of a janitor claiming skills that should belong to people with proper credentials and appropriate social status. "This is insane, Sophia. You can't seriously be considering." But Sophia was considering it because she was desperate and because this man had just volunteered with the kind of steady certainty that professional pilots displayed when discussing their expertise. She studied his face, looking for signs of delusion or desperation or humor at her expense. But his expression remained neutral, patient, waiting for her decision without trying to persuade her one way or another. Every rational calculation said this was a terrible idea. The liability exposure alone could destroy her career if anything went wrong. The board would have questions. Insurance would refuse to cover. And if this janitor was lying or delusional or simply overconfident about skills he didn't actually possess, the consequences would range from embarrassing to catastrophic. But Sophia Castellano hadn't become the youngest female CEO in aerospace by making only safe decisions. She'd taken calculated risks that people with more experience had advised against, and those risks had paid off more often than they'd failed. This was risk, huge, potentially career-ending risk. But the alternative was missing the tech wing meeting and losing a contract that Castellano Aviation desperately needed. She made a decision that felt reckless even as she committed to it, smiled with the cold precision that had made grown men nervous in contract negotiations. Let the mockery show in her voice and her expression, because if this was going to be disaster, she might as well enjoy the brief moment of superiority before everything fell apart. The words came out sharp and clear, designed to humiliate and dismiss and establish exactly how little she thought of this janitor's claim, while simultaneously calling his bluff in the most public way possible. Fly this helicopter perfectly, and I'll marry you. Jennifer's jaw dropped. Kevin looked like he'd swallowed his tablet. The rooftop fell silent except for the wind and the traffic noise from 42 floors below. The janitor's expression didn't flicker. No embarrassment, no anger, no reaction whatsoever to being mocked by the CEO of the company that employed him. He just nodded once, voice steady and unchanged. "Yes, ma'am." Then he turned and walked toward the helicopter like he'd done it 1,000 times before, movements purposeful and unhurried. Someone who knew exactly what he was about to do and needed no further discussion to proceed. Sophia stood frozen, watching him climb into the pilot's seat with the kind of fluid confidence that suggested this wasn't his first time in a cockpit. Jennifer grabbed her arm, voice urgent and genuinely concerned beneath the condescension. "You're not actually getting in that thing with him." Sophia pulled away, eyes never leaving the man who was now settling into the pilot's seat and reaching for her controls with hands that moved automatically to their positions. "We don't have another option. He could kill you. He could crash the helicopter. He could... If he was going to kill me, he wouldn't have volunteered in front of witnesses." Sophia's voice was cold calculated, running through the risk assessment even as she walked toward the passenger door. "And if he crashes, at least I'll die knowing I tried everything instead of just accepting defeat because some janitor made an absurd claim." She climbed into the passenger seat before Jennifer could protest further, before her own survival instincts could override the desperate calculation that had made this seem like acceptable risk. The cockpit smelled like leather and aviation fuel and something mechanical that Sophia didn't have vocabulary to identify. The man she realized she didn't even know his name was running through pre-flight checks with a systematic efficiency that suggested actual training rather than video game knowledge. His hands moved over instruments with practiced ease, eyes scanning displays in pattern that looked professional to someone who'd spent enough time around aviation to recognize competence when she saw it. Sophia fastened her seatbelt with hands that were trembling, despite her determination to maintain composure. Put on the headset that would let them communicate over the rotor noise. The man's voice came through calm and professional, asking questions like this was routine flight instead of potentially suicidal gamble. "Ready, Miss Castellano?" Her throat was tight, but her voice came out steady. "Let's go." The engine roared to life with mechanical thunder that Sophia felt in her chest, vibration traveling through the seat and into her bones. The rotor blades began spinning slowly at first, then faster, building speed until they were cutting through air with rhythmic thrum that was part physics and part something that felt almost musical. On the rooftop, Jennifer and Kevin stood watching with expressions that mixed horror and fascination. Neither of them quite believing what they were witnessing, their CEO climbing into a helicopter, piloted by a janitor based on nothing but his word and her desperate need to make a meeting on time. The helicopter lifted off, smoothly, perfectly, rising above the building with the kind of controlled ascent that spoke to thousands of hours of experience, making the physics of flight look effortless. Sophia's breath caught in her throat as the rooftop dropped away beneath them, the city spreading out in all directions, Elliott Bay gleaming in the morning sun like polished metal. The man, the janitor who apparently knew how to fly helicopters with professional competence, adjusted altitude with touch so light that the aircraft barely tilted. His hands rested on controls with the relaxed confidence that came from muscle memory rather than conscious thought, making micro-adjustments that kept them stable despite wind currents that would have rattled less experienced pilots. Sophia couldn't take her eyes off him. This wasn't beginner's luck. This wasn't someone who'd taken weekend lessons and thought they could handle commercial aircraft. This was mastery, the kind of flying that looked easy because every decision was correct, every adjustment perfectly timed, every movement executed with precision that suggested elite training. She watched his eyes scan instruments, horizon, airspace around them, absorbing information with systematic efficiency that military pilots displayed during complex operations. Watched his hands make corrections so subtle that she only noticed when the helicopter responded with movements that felt like breathing rather than mechanical adjustment. This was performance art at altitude, and she was watching virtuoso who'd been hiding in plain sight. The flight path took them over downtown Seattle, threading between air traffic corridors with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where civilian helicopters were permitted to fly and how to navigate the invisible boundaries that separated legal operation from airspace violations. The man maintained perfect altitude, perfect heading, perfect everything, while Sophia sat in the passenger seat having her entire understanding of reality systematically dismantled by 12 minutes of watching a janitor fly like professional pilot. Her mind raced through possibilities, trying to explain what she was witnessing. Former commercial pilot who'd lost his license and was working maintenance while trying to get certified again. Military washout who'd learned to fly but couldn't handle the pressure. Rich kid who'd burned through inheritance and was slumming in minimum wage jobs while figuring out his life. None of the explanations quite fit because this level of competence suggested not just training but extensive experience, the kind of accumulated expertise that came from flying in conditions that required split-second decisions and absolute precision. This wasn't someone who'd learned to fly as hobby. This was someone for whom flying had been profession or calling or both. The Bell 407 banked left over Elliott Bay with moved bank so smooth that Sophia's coffee cup in the center console didn't shift despite the change in orientation. Below them, ferries cut white wakes through dark water, and the Olympic Mountains rose in the distance like serrated blade against the horizon. Sophia's hands gripped the armrest not from fear anymore, but from the profound disorientation that came from having every assumption shattered by evidence that couldn't be argued with. This man, this janitor, whose name she didn't even know, was flying her across Seattle with expertise that most professional pilots couldn't match, and he was doing it with the casual competence of someone who'd done far more difficult things in far more dangerous circumstances. She tried to speak to ask the questions that were piling up faster than she could process them, but her throat was too tight and her brain was too busy trying to reconcile what she was seeing with what she thought she knew about the world and how it worked. Finally, she managed to force words through the headset voice carrying genuine confusion beneath the control she was desperately trying to maintain. "Where did you learn to fly like this?" The man didn't look at her, eyes remaining focused on instruments and horizon and the careful navigation that kept them on course toward TechWing Aviation's headquarters on the south end of the city. His voice was neutral when he answered, almost detached, like he was discussing weather rather than skills that suggested military training or professional aviation background. "I used to do this for a living." The statement raised more questions than it answered, but before Sophia could ask follow-up, the man was already descending toward TechWing's private landing pad with the kind of precision approach that suggested he'd done this exact maneuver hundreds or thousands of times. The touchdown was perfect. Not good, not acceptable. Perfect, the kind of landing that didn't even rattle the coffee cup. The kind of landing that professional pilots practiced for years to achieve consistently. The kind of landing that made clear this wasn't luck or accident, but the result of expertise so thoroughly internalized that excellence was default rather than achievement. The man powered down the engine with the same systematic efficiency he'd shown during pre-flight hands moving through the shutdown sequence, while rotor blades gradually slowed their rotation. He removed his headset, unbuckled his harness, and stepped out of the cockpit without a word, like this had been routine transportation rather than impossible demonstration of skills that janitors weren't supposed to possess. Sophia sat in her seat, hands still gripping armrests, staring straight ahead at the TechWing Aviation building, where executives were probably watching through windows, wondering who just landed their helicopter with such professional precision. Her entire body was trembling, not from fear, but from shock, from the cognitive dissonance of spending 12 minutes watching reality reorganize itself around new information that shouldn't be possible. She unbuckled slowly, climbed out of the helicopter on legs that felt uncertain, and walked toward the building entrance where TechWing's chief operating officer was waiting, with expression that suggested she'd been watching the landing and had questions about who was piloting Castellano's executive transport. The janitor, stood by the helicopter with hands in his pockets, watching Sophia walk away with expression that was unreadable. She paused halfway to the building, turned back, met his eyes across the helipad, while automatic doors slid open behind her and her professional future waited inside. The question came out before she could stop it, genuine and confused and carrying none of the mockery that had flavored her earlier words. "Who are you?" The man's expression softened just slightly, something that might have been pain or regret or resignation crossing his face so quickly that Sophia almost missed it. His voice was quiet when he answered, barely audible over the wind and the city noise and the sound of the helicopter's engine cooling in the morning air. "Someone who used to matter." Then he turned and walked back toward the helicopter, leaving Sophia standing there with the automatic doors opening behind her and her entire understanding of the world requiring urgent reconstruction. The Tech Wing Aviation Conference Room was all glass and polished wood, and the kind of expensive minimalism that successful companies use to signal their importance. Dr. Helen Zhao, Chief Operating Officer, sat at the head of the table with two senior executives flanking her, all of them wearing the professional smiles that meant this meeting was formality, because the real negotiations had happened over 6 months of phone calls and email exchanges. Sophia forced herself to sit down to shake hands and exchange pleasantries and review contract terms like her brain wasn't still processing 12 minutes of watching someone who mopped floors fly helicopter with expertise that suggested military training or professional aviation background or something that made absolutely no sense. Dr. Zhao was in her late 50s, sharp and direct in the way that aerospace executives tended to be when they'd spent decades in industry dominated by men who underestimated women until competence proved them wrong. Her voice carried genuine warmth beneath the professional formality. "That was quite an entrance. Your pilot has impressive skills." Sophia's throat tightened, but her CEO mask held firm, the performance of confidence that she'd perfected over 18 months of board meetings, where showing uncertainty meant losing control. "Yes, he's very good at what he does." The meeting proceeded with the scripted efficiency of negotiations that had already been won, contract terms reviewed, financial arrangements confirmed, timeline established for component deliveries starting in Q2. Sophia signed documents while some part of her brain remained on the rooftop helipad watching a janitor volunteer to fly, and then proceeding to fly with mastery that professional pilots spent careers developing. Dr. Zhao's voice pulled her back to the present. "We're very pleased to be partnering with Castellano Aviation. Your father built an excellent company, and from everything we've seen, you're taking it to the next level." The words should have felt like vindication, confirmation that Sophia had proven herself worthy of the position Victor had given her. Instead, they felt distant and abstract because validation from Tech Wing executives meant less than it should when her entire understanding of reality was being rewritten by information that didn't fit into any framework she possessed. The meeting concluded at 11:47 a.m. Handshakes and smiles and promises to coordinate over the next few weeks as implementation teams began working together. Dr. Zhao walked Sophia to the building entrance with the kind of professional courtesy that suggested she was genuinely pleased about the partnership rather than just performing satisfaction for business purposes. "Your pilot, is he available for consultation work? We're developing new training simulators, and we could use someone with his level of expertise." Sophia's mind went blank for a moment because the question made sense if you believed that the person flying the helicopter was legitimate pilot with credentials and background that made him viable consultant. But the person flying the helicopter was janitor who worked night shift at Castellano Aviation for $15 an hour, and Sophia had no idea how to explain that to Tech Wing's COO without sounding insane. Her voice came out steady despite the confusion roiling beneath her professional composure. "I'll have to check his availability and get back to you." They shook hands one final time. Sophia stepped outside into October sunshine that felt too bright, too normal for a morning when the universe had revealed that janitors could fly helicopters with professional competence, and CEOs could be catastrophically wrong about who deserved their attention. The Bell 407 was gone. The landing pad sat empty, no sign of the man who'd flown her across Seattle with expertise that suggested training and experience that janitors weren't supposed to possess. Sophia stood there for a moment, staring at empty concrete, while her brain tried to process the absence, the vanishing act that made the past hour feel almost dreamlike. She pulled out her phone and called Kevin Ross, who answered immediately with voice that carried residual panic from watching his CEO climb into helicopter, piloted by maintenance staff. Kevin's words tumbled out fast. "Oh my God, Sophia, are you okay? Did he actually fly you there?" Did you crash? Are you alive? I'm fine. The flight was perfect. Where's the helicopter? The janitor, he flew it back here about 20 minutes ago. Landed on the roof, powered down, and disappeared back to wherever janitors go when they're not flying million-dollar aircraft. Jennifer is freaking out. She thinks we should fire him for I don't even know what for. Unauthorized use of company equipment. Being too good at things he's not supposed to know how to do. Sophia's voice was cold and sharp, cutting through Kevin's rambling with precision that made people stop talking and start listening. Don't fire him. Don't talk to him. Don't do anything until I get back. And get me his employee file. Everything we have on record. She hung up before Kevin could ask questions. She didn't have answers for, then called for a car service because the tech wing meeting had ended early, and she had no way to get back to Castellano Aviation except ground transportation that would take 45 minutes instead of the 12-minute flight that had shattered her understanding of reality. The drive back gave her time to think, to run through scenarios that might explain what she'd witnessed. Former military pilot who'd left service and was working maintenance jobs while dealing with PTSD or financial problems or personal crises that made minimum wage preferable to aviation careers. Commercial pilot who'd lost his license due to medical issues or regulatory violations and was rebuilding his life from the bottom up. Rich kid who'd learned to fly as hobby and was now experiencing what poverty felt like after family money disappeared. None of the explanations quite fit, because they all required believing that someone with elite aviation skills would choose to mop floors instead of pursuing careers that paid six figures and came with prestige that janitors would never experience. The economics didn't make sense. The psychology didn't make sense. Nothing made sense except the empirical evidence that she'd spent 12 minutes watching someone fly a helicopter with mastery that couldn't be faked or learned casually. Sophia arrived at Castellano Aviation at 12:34 p.m., took the elevator to the 42nd floor, and walked into her office where Kevin was waiting with a manila folder that looked disappointingly thin for a document that was supposed to explain how a janitor knew how to fly helicopters. She opened the file and read through contents that raised more questions than they answered. Marcus Hayes' position: Janitorial Staff Department Facilities. Maintenance hire date: February 14th, 8 months ago. Salary: $15.50 hour shift. Night: 11:00 p.m. 7:00 a.m. Emergency contact. None listed in prior employment. None listed references. None provided education. None listed background. Check. Criminal record. Clean. No red flags. It was ghost file employment record, so minimal that it suggested deliberate obscuring of personal history rather than person who simply had no history worth mentioning. Sophia had seen files like this before, people who were running from something or hiding from someone or rebuilding lives after catastrophic failures that they didn't want future employers knowing about. She closed the folder and he looked at Kevin, who was hovering near her desk with expression that mixed curiosity and concern. What else do we know about him? Nothing. He applied for the maintenance position in person, filled out the application by hand, passed the background check, and started work 2 weeks later. Works night shifts, stays late, sometimes never causes problems. Jennifer says he's the quietest employee she's ever met. Shows up, does his job, leaves without talking to anyone. Does he have family, friends, any connections to other employees? Kevin shrugged. Not that anyone knows about. He's basically invisible. The kind of employee you forget exists until something goes wrong with the plumbing or someone needs the executive bathroom cleaned. Sophia sat down at her desk, staring at the thin manila folder that represented everything Castellano Aviation knew about Marcus Hayes. The name felt wrong, somehow too ordinary for someone who'd just demonstrated extraordinary skills. She picked up her phone and scrolled through contacts until she found the name she needed. Sarah Chen had been Sophia's roommate at Stanford, brilliant engineering student who'd gone into military intelligence after graduation and now worked at Boeing doing something classified that involved analyzing foreign aviation technology. They'd stayed in touch over the years, close enough that Sarah owed Sophia favors, and distant enough that asking those favors wouldn't damage their friendship. Sophia called her personal cell and Sarah answered on the third ring with voice that suggested she was between meetings and had maybe 30 seconds to talk. Sophia, what's up? I'm about to walk into a briefing. I need you to run a name through military records, quietly, No official requests, no paper trail. Pause. What kind of name? Someone who might have been a pilot, Army or Air Force probably, left service sometime in the past few years. I need to know why. Sarah's voice shifted from casual to intrigued, the tone she used when problems became interesting rather than routine. You know, I can't just access classified personnel files without authorization. I'm not asking for classified files. I'm asking you to check publicly available discharge records and maybe stretch the definition of publicly available to include things that someone with your security clearance could access if they were properly motivated. Sarah laughed. What did this guy do that's got you calling in favors at noon on a Tuesday? He flew me across Seattle in a helicopter with the kind of precision that suggests combat experience or elite training or both. But according to his employment record, he's a janitor with no aviation background. Silence. Then Sarah's voice came back serious and focused the shift that happened when she was processing information that didn't fit expected patterns. Give me the name. I'll see what I can find. Marcus Hayes. Approximately 32 years old based on appearance. Hired at my company 8 months ago. No prior employment listed, no references, minimal background. I'll call you back. The line went dead. Sophia set down her phone and leaned back in her leather chair, staring at the Seattle skyline through floor-to-ceiling windows, while her mind replayed the morning's events frame by frame. The way Marcus had approached on the rooftop with quiet confidence. The mockery from Jennifer that he'd absorbed without reaction. The perfect pre-flight sequence and the flawless flying and the touchdown so gentle it hadn't disturbed the coffee cup. Someone who used to matter. The phrase echoed in her head, carrying weight that suggested profound loss rather than simple career change. People who used to matter were people who'd fallen from positions of importance, people who'd walked away from identities that defined them, people who were hiding from pasts that had become unbearable for reasons that mere employment files couldn't capture. Sophia opened her laptop and searched for Marcus Hayes pilot in various combinations, knowing the effort was probably futile because people who deliberately obscured their backgrounds didn't leave digital trails that Google could follow. The search returned hundreds of results, none of them obviously connected to the man who'd flown her helicopter that morning. She tried military databases that were publicly accessible, searching discharge records and Medal of Honor recipients and casualty lists, but nothing matched the limited information she had. Marcus Hayes was a common enough name that finding the right person without additional identifying information was a needle in haystack probability. Her phone buzzed at 2:47 p.m. with call from Sarah Chen. Sophia answered immediately, heart rate accelerating with anticipation that felt disproportionate to the situation, but which she couldn't quite suppress. Sarah's voice carried that particular tone that suggested she'd found something significant. You sitting down? Sophia's pulse quickened. Just tell me. Marcus Hayes, Captain United States Army helicopter pilot. 2 tours in Afghanistan between 2017 and 2020. Highly decorated. Honorable discharge 3 years ago under compassionate leave circumstances. The words hit Sophia like physical impact, each one reorganizing her understanding of who Marcus Hayes was and why he'd been mopping floors instead of flying aircraft for organizations that would have paid him 6 figures to do exactly what she'd watched him do that morning. Her throat was tight when she spoke. What kind of decorations? Sarah's voice dropped lower, almost reverent, in the way people spoke when discussing genuine heroism rather than bureaucratic recognition. Medal of Valor, Distinguished Flying Cross, Purple Heart. The guy's a legitimate war hero, Sophia. He pulled 6 soldiers out of a hot landing zone in Kandahar province in 2019 while taking enemy fire. The citation says he made 3 trips under fire, when 1 trip would have been considered above and beyond. Sophia closed her eyes, the image of Marcus standing on her rooftop in janitor's uniform, superimposing over the image Sarah's words created, Captain Hayes in combat gear flying into danger to save his brothers, while bullets tore through metal and people died around him. Why did he leave? You said compassionate discharge. Silence on the other end that suggested Sarah was debating how much to share, the hesitation that came from accessing information that wasn't technically public, but which intelligence analysts could find if they knew where to look and didn't worry too much about protocol. Finally, Sarah spoke, voice careful. His wife died. Car accident. She was 8 months pregnant. He had emergency leave to come home, and he never went back. Filed for discharge under compassionate circumstances. Newborn son in critical condition, no other family support. Army granted it because nobody wants to force a Medal of Valor recipient to stay in service when his personal life has just been destroyed. Sophia felt something crack in her chest, empathy she didn't want to feel for a man she'd mocked 3 hours earlier. A hero, a father. A man who'd lost everything and chosen invisibility over recognition because recognition required being the person who'd failed to protect the people who mattered most. Anything else? Sarah paused. The discharge was honorable and his record is exemplary, but there's a note in his file about psychological evaluation. Standard procedure after combat trauma, but the evaluator recommended ongoing counseling for PTSD related to both combat experience and personal loss. I don't know if he followed up on that recommendation, but the fact that he's working as a janitor instead of flying for commercial carriers suggests maybe he's not ready to be Captain Hayes again. Or maybe he doesn't want to be. Maybe. People process trauma differently. Some people run toward their identities. Some people run away. Sounds like your guy chose the second option. Sophia thanked Sarah and ended the call, then sat in her office staring at nothing while the afternoon sun tracked across her windows and the city continued its endless motion 42 floors below. The manila folder on her desk that had seemed disappointingly thin now felt almost obscene in its inadequacy. How could 8 months of employment be summarized in half a page when the employee in question was decorated war hero who'd saved 6 lives under fire and lost his wife and child and walked away from everything that made him who he was, and she'd mocked him, laughed at him through Jennifer's voice and her own cruel joke about marriage, made him an object of ridicule because he wore gray uniform and pushed a mop and had the audacity to claim skills that people in his position weren't supposed to possess. The guilt hit Sophia harder than she'd expected. Shame that felt disproportionate because she hadn't known who Marcus Hayes was when she made the joke, but ignorance felt like inadequate defense when the joke had been designed to humiliate regardless of his background. She stood and walked to her windows, looking down at Seattle spreading beneath her, like circuit board of illuminated possibilities, and wondered how many other people she'd dismissed based on uniforms and job titles and assumptions about who deserved her attention. The rest of the afternoon passed in distracted inefficiency that was unusual for Sophia. She reviewed quarterly reports without absorbing numbers, responded to emails without registering content, sat through a conference call about supply chain logistics without contributing meaningful input. Her mind kept returning to 12 minutes of watching Marcus Hayes fly helicopter with expertise that suggested he'd spent years making impossible look routine, contrasted against image of him standing on rooftop saying, "Someone who used to matter," with resignation that spoke to profound loss. At 6:00 p.m., Sophia did something she rarely did. She left her office early, took the elevator down to the 38th floor where facilities maintenance had their break room and equipment storage. The space was empty at this hour because night shift hadn't started yet and day shift maintenance staff had already gone home. She found Marcus's locker by checking the name tags, feeling slightly absurd about investigating a janitor's personal space, but unable to suppress the curiosity that had been building since Sarah's phone call. The locker was standard issue metal combination lock, keeping it secure, nothing visible through the ventilation slits except darkness. Sophia turned to leave and almost collided with Marcus himself, who was walking into the break room, wearing his gray uniform and carrying a small backpack that looked like it had seen better decades. He stopped when he saw her expression shifting from neutral to guarded in the space of a heartbeat. They stood there for a moment, CEO and janitor, Sophia in her Armani suit and Marcus in his maintenance uniform, the class divide between them so obvious that it felt almost absurd that she was the one who felt uncomfortable. Marcus spoke first, voice quiet and careful. "Miss Castellano, is there a problem?" Sophia's throat was tight, but her voice came out steady. "No, She paused, trying to find words for impulse that she didn't quite understand herself. "I never thanked you for this morning, for the flight." Marcus shrugged, the motion casual, but somehow also dismissive, like flying CEOs across cities was routine favor rather than extraordinary demonstration of skills that shouldn't belong to maintenance staff. Just doing what needed to be done. That's not... Sophia stopped herself, recognizing that arguing about the significance of what he'd done would only make this conversation more awkward than it already was. She changed tactics. I know who you are, what you were. Captain Hayes, Medal of Valor, Afghanistan. Marcus's jaw tightened the first crack in the careful neutrality he'd maintained since walking into the break room. For a moment she saw something flicker in his eyes, not anger, something closer to resignation, or maybe pain, the look of someone who'd been hoping to stay invisible and was confronting the reality that invisibility had just failed. Then you know I'm not that person anymore. The words came out firm, but not hostile statement of fact rather than defensive declaration. Sophia felt something twist in her chest, recognition that this man, this decorated war hero who'd saved 6 soldiers under fire, genuinely believed that he'd stop mattering when he stopped being Captain Hayes. Her voice softened despite her intention to maintain professional distance. Maybe you're not, but you're still someone. Marcus didn't respond, just stood there holding his backpack and waiting for her to leave or say whatever she'd come to say or do whatever CEOs did when they cornered janitors in break rooms to discuss their secret identities. The stairwell door opened and a small boy appeared, maybe 5 years old, with blonde hair and cautious eyes, carrying a notebook covered in crayon drawings. He spotted Marcus and his face lit up with the kind of pure joy that children showed when they saw parents after separation. Daddy, the boy ran to Marcus, who caught him with the practiced ease of someone who'd done this many times, lifting the child onto his hip with movements that suggested this was routine rather than special occasion. The boy wrapped arms around Marcus's neck and buried his face against his shoulder, and Sophia watched the transformation that happened when Marcus looked at his son, the careful neutrality melting into something warmer, something that looked almost like peace. Marcus's voice was gentle when he spoke to the boy. Hey buddy, did you have a good day? The boy nodded against his shoulder, then seemed to notice Sophia standing nearby. He pulled back to look at her with curious eyes that assessed her the way children assessed adults, with honesty that hadn't yet learned to be polite. Sophia crouched down to the boy's eye-level voice, softening in ways that surprised her because she didn't generally interact with children and hadn't expected maternal instincts to activate in break room conversations with janitors' sons. Hi, what's your name? The boy looked at Marcus for permission. Marcus gave small nod, and the boy looked back at Sophia with expression that was still cautious but less guarded than before. Dylan, I'm 5. Hi Dylan, I'm Sophia. I work here too, like your dad. Dylan's face brightened slightly. Do you clean floors too? The question was innocent, but it landed with weight that made Sophia's chest tighten, because from Dylan's perspective, everyone who worked at Castellano Aviation probably cleaned floors or did similar maintenance work. The concept of executives in corner offices making 6 figures while his father mopped those floors for minimum wage would mean nothing to a 5-year-old whose entire world was shaped by the economic reality that his father had chosen or been forced into. Sophia's voice was gentle. No, I do different work, but I met your dad this morning. He helped me with something important. Dylan's eyes went wide with pride that made Sophia's throat close up. Did he fly you somewhere? He's the best pilot in the world. The statement was delivered with absolute certainty that suggested Marcus had told his son about his aviation background, that Dylan knew his father used to be someone important, even if he couldn't quite understand why that person now mopped floors instead of flying helicopters. Sophia looked up at Marcus, who was watching her with unreadable expression, then back at Dylan with genuine smile that felt unfamiliar on her face. Yes, he flew me somewhere. And you're right, he's the best pilot I've ever met. Dylan beamed, pulling his notebook from under his arm and opening it to show Sophia pages filled with crayon drawings of helicopters. They were surprisingly detailed for a 5-year-old, rotors and tail booms and landing skids, all rendered with the kind of careful attention that suggested Dylan had spent considerable time studying the aircraft that his father used to fly. The boy pointed to one drawing that showed a helicopter with 2 stick figures inside. This is my dad. He used to save people. Now he cleans buildings, but someday he's going to fly again. The words hit Sophia harder than they should have, childish optimism, carrying weight that adult statements couldn't match, because Dylan believed what he was saying with the kind of faith that didn't require evidence or logic. He believed his father would fly again because fathers were supposed to be heroes, and heroes didn't stay hidden forever. Sophia stood slowly, looking at Marcus over Dylan's head. He's right, about you being the best pilot in the world. Marcus's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Recognition maybe, or acknowledgement, or just the tired acceptance of someone who'd heard compliments before and knew they didn't change anything about circumstances that had forced him into gray uniform and minimum wage. Thank you for saying that, Miss Castellano, but we should go. Dylan needs dinner and I need to start my shift soon. Sophia nodded, stepping back to let them pass. But as Marcus walked toward the stairwell with Dylan on his hip, she called after him with words that came out before she could analyze whether they were appropriate. Marcus, he turned back, waiting. You didn't stop mattering when you stopped being Captain Hayes. You just started mattering in different ways. Marcus looked at her for a long moment, expression unreadable, then gave small nod and disappeared through the stairwell door with his son, leaving Sophia standing in the break room, surrounded by lockers and cleaning supplies, and the ghost of a conversation that had revealed more about her own assumptions than about the man she'd been investigating. That night, Sophia sat in her waterfront condo overlooking Elliott Bay, glass of wine untouched on the table beside her, staring at city lights reflected in dark water, while her mind replayed the day's events in endless loop. She'd woken up that morning a CEO who thought she understood how the world worked, that competence was visible, that people in positions of authority deserved those positions because they'd earned them through talent and effort, that janitors mopped floors because they lacked the skills or education or ambition to do anything more valuable. She'd gone to bed understanding that everything she'd believed was framework, built on assumptions that couldn't survive contact with reality. That competence could be invisible when it wore the wrong uniform. That decorated war heroes might choose minimum wage over careers that required being people they couldn't be anymore. That 5-year-old boys could understand truths about their fathers that CEOs missed completely because they never bothered to look past job titles. The tech wing contract sat on her desk, signed and finalized, $12 million secured through combination of 6 months negotiation and 12 minutes of flying from someone who shouldn't have been able to fly, but who demonstrated mastery that had made the impossible look routine. Sophia picked up her phone and composed email to Dr. Helen Zhao, TechWing's COO, responding to the question about Marcus's availability for consultation work. Dr. Zhao, regarding your inquiry about my pilot's availability for training simulator consultation, I need to do some additional research on his current commitments, but I believe he may be interested in discussing the opportunity. I'll follow up with you next week once I've had a chance to speak with him directly. Best regards, Sophia Castellano. She sent the email before she could second-guess the decision, then sat back and wondered what she was doing, offering consultation contracts to janitors who'd made clear they didn't want to be noticed or recognized or pulled back into identities they'd walked away from. But TechWing was offering $50,000 for a flight demonstration at their annual summit, and Dylan Hayes deserved opportunities that minimum wage couldn't provide. And maybe Sophia Castellano could do something useful with the guilt that was eating at her, since realizing she'd mocked a Medal of Valor recipient for having the audacity to claim skills he'd earned through years of service that she couldn't imagine. Her phone buzzed at 11:47 p.m. with text from Jennifer Blake, who apparently worked late even when her CEO wasn't in the office. Richard Brennan called. He wants to discuss recent events at Thursday's board meeting. I think he's going to raise questions about the helicopter situation. Thought you should know. Jay. Sophia stared at the text with resignation that came from 18 months of dealing with board politics. Richard Brennan was senior board member, 58 years old, Victor's contemporary, who believed Sophia was too young and too female to run Castellano Aviation. He'd been waiting for her to make a mistake that would justify pushing her out and letting a janitor fly the company helicopter, probably qualified as the kind of reckless decision-making that would support his narrative about emotional leadership. She typed back a response. Thanks for the heads up. Let him raise questions. I'll have answers. Sophia set down her phone and returned to watching city lights reflected in dark water, wondering how she was going to explain to the board that the janitor who'd flown their CEO across Seattle was decorated war hero, who'd saved 6 lives under fire, and who probably had more aviation expertise than most commercial pilots they could have hired. The explanation would require revealing Marcus's background, which would destroy the invisibility he'd chosen and might force him to leave Castellano Aviation to find another minimum wage job where people wouldn't know he used to be Captain Hayes. But not explaining would mean facing Richard Brennan's questions without adequate defense, which would undermine her authority and make the board question her judgment in ways that could cost her the CEO position she'd spent 18 months proving she deserved. Sophia fell asleep on her couch sometime after 1:00 a.m. Still dressed in her Armani suit, still holding her phone, still trying to figure out how to protect someone who didn't want protection while defending herself against people who wanted her to fail. The next 3 days passed in observation that Sophia told herself was professional due diligence, but which felt increasingly like something else, curiosity mixed with guilt, mixed with growing recognition that Marcus Hayes was more interesting as a person than most of the executives she dealt with daily. She started noticing things she'd never paid attention to before, details that had been invisible when Marcus was just another maintenance worker, whose presence registered as background noise rather than actual human being worthy of attention. She saw him Wednesday night at 11:47 p.m. in the break room on the 38th floor, heating leftovers in the microwave, while Dylan slept on the bench nearby, small, body curled around his notebook of helicopter drawings. Marcus moved quietly, checking the food temperature with the back of his hand before eating, the kind of careful attention that suggested he'd been doing this for a while and had learned to be efficient about meals that had to happen during work hours. She watched through her office window, darkened so he wouldn't see her watching, as Marcus paused eating to check Dylan's forehead for fever, the gesture so gentle it made Sophia's chest ache with recognition that this man carried responsibilities that went far beyond mopping floors. He was father and provider and protector, all compressed into a single person who worked night shift so his son could sleep nearby, instead of being left with sitters who charged money that minimum wage couldn't cover. Thursday night, she saw him carry Dylan to the building's small medical office because the boy had a low-grade fever. Marcus didn't ask for help from security or call anyone or make it into a crisis that required other people's intervention. He just handled it with quiet competence that suggested he'd been handling Dylan's medical issues alone since his wife died and their son was born 2 months premature, fighting for his life in a NICU. Sophia made a note to ensure the medical office was always stocked with children's Tylenol and to ask HR if there were any support programs for single parents working late shifts, then recognized that both impulses came from watching Marcus and wanting to help in ways that wouldn't require him to ask for help, because asking seemed like something he wouldn't do. Friday night, Sophia worked late, deliberately telling herself it was because quarterly reports needed reviewing, but knowing it was because Marcus's shift started at 11 a.m. and ended at 7 a.m., and somewhere in that 8-hour window, he would pass through the executive floors with Dylan sleeping on benches while his father cleaned up after people who made more in a month than Marcus made in a year. At 12:34 a.m., she heard voices in the hallway outside her office, Marcus's quiet rumble and Dylan's higher voice asking questions about airplanes. Sophia stood and walked to her door, opening it just as Marcus was passing with Dylan on his shoulders, the boy's head resting against his father's with the comfortable weight of a child who'd fallen asleep mid-conversation. Marcus stopped when he saw her expression shifting to the careful neutrality he wore when encountering executives. "Miss Castellano, I'm sorry if we disturbed you." Sophia shook her head. "You didn't. I was just—" She paused, unsure how to explain what she was doing or why she'd deliberately stayed late, hoping to encounter them. "Working late." Dylan stirred at the sound of her voice, lifting his head to look at her with sleepy eyes that took a moment to focus. When he recognized her, he smiled with the unself-conscious warmth that children showed to adults they decided were safe. "Miss Sophia, did you see my new drawing?" Before Sophia could respond, Dylan was pulling his notebook from his backpack and flipping to a page that showed a helicopter remarkably similar to the Bell 407, with 2 stick figures visible through the cockpit windows. One figure was labeled Dad in careful letters. The other was labeled MS Sophia. The drawing hit Sophia harder than it should have, childish representation of the flight that had shattered her understanding of reality 3 days ago. Dylan had witnessed that flight from the rooftop, watching his father fly away with the CEO who'd mocked his claim, and instead of processing it as trauma or fear, he'd turned it into evidence that his father was exactly who Dylan believed him to be, the best pilot in the world. Sophia's voice was softer than she'd intended when she spoke. "That's beautiful, Dylan. You're a very talented artist." Dylan beamed. "Dad says artists have to practice every day. So I draw helicopters every day, and someday I'll be good like the people who make real drawings." Marcus's hand rested gently on Dylan's back, the gesture protective in ways that suggested he was always ready to intervene if conversations went directions he didn't want them going. His voice was quiet when he spoke. "We should let Miss Castellano get back to work, buddy. She's got important things to do." But Dylan wasn't ready to be redirected. He looked at Sophia with the kind of direct honesty that children deployed before learning to be polite. "Do you have a family? Miss Sophia, do you have kids?" The question landed with unexpected weight because the answer was no on both counts, and Sophia had spent 18 months telling herself that family was distraction from career goals, and children were responsibilities she didn't need when running a company required all her attention. Her voice came out carefully neutral. "No, Dylan, I don't have kids, just me and my work." Dylan's expression shifted to something that looked like sympathy. The kind of empathy that 5-year-olds displayed when they recognized loneliness in adults, even if they couldn't articulate what they were seeing. "That's sad. Everyone should have family." Marcus's hand tightened slightly on Dylan's back, silent signal that the boy had crossed into territory that required parental intervention. "Dylan, that's enough questions. Miss Castellano's family situation is her business, not ours." But Sophia found herself speaking before Marcus could redirect Dylan's attention. "It's okay, he's right, everyone should have family. I just haven't found mine yet." Dylan had nodded seriously, then offered solution with the straightforward logic that children applied to complex problems. "You could be part of our family. We're small, but Dad says small families are good because you know everyone and nobody gets forgotten." The offer was innocent, childish generosity that meant nothing, except that Dylan had decided Sophia was worthy of inclusion in his limited world. But it hit Sophia with force that made her throat tighten because nobody had invited her into their family in the 3 years since Brandon left, and she'd built walls high enough to prevent anyone from getting close enough to hurt her. Marcus's voice was firm but gentle. "Dylan, you can't just invite people into our family. Miss Castellano has her own life." Dylan looked between his father and Sophia with confusion that suggested he genuinely didn't understand why adults made things complicated when solutions were obvious. "But she's nice, and she said Dad's the best pilot. Nice people who say true things should be family." Sophia felt tears sting her eyes, unexpected emotion that she blinked away quickly before anyone could notice. She crouched down to Dylan's eye-level voice, steady despite the tightness in her chest. "Thank you, Dylan. That's one of the nicest things anyone has ever said to me." Dylan smiled, satisfied that he'd accomplished his goal of making the sad lady feel better. Then his eyes started closing again, exhaustion winning over his desire to continue the conversation. Marcus shifted him higher on his shoulders, the motion automatic and practiced. "We really should go. Dylan needs to sleep in an actual bed instead of office benches." Sophia stood, nodding her understanding. But before Marcus could turn away, she spoke again with words that felt risky but necessary. "Techwing Aviation contacted me. They want to hire a consultant for their pilot training simulator project. Someone with real-world combat and civilian experience. They specifically asked if you'd be interested." Marcus's expression didn't change, but Sophia saw his jaw tighten, the physical tell that suggested she'd just proposed something he didn't want to consider. "I appreciate the thought, but I'm not interested. It pays well, $50,000 for a single flight demonstration at their annual summit, plus scholarship for Dylan at Seattle Academy through high school." The numbers hung in the air, financial security that would transform Dylan's educational opportunities and give Marcus breathing room he didn't currently have. But Marcus's voice remained steady when he responded, no hesitation despite the obvious benefits. "I said no, Miss Castellano. I appreciate the offer, but I don't want to be noticed. I don't want to be pulled back into being Captain Hayes. I just want to clean floors and raise my son and live quietly without people asking questions about who I used to be." Sophia felt the rejection like physical blow, not because she needed Marcus to accept, but because his refusal made clear that he'd chosen invisibility deliberately, and her attempts to help were unwelcome interference in choices he'd made for reasons she couldn't fully understand. "I understand. I'm sorry if I overstepped." Marcus's expression softened slightly. "You didn't overstep. You were trying to help. But the best help you can give me is letting me disappear back into being nobody important." Then he turned and walked toward the stairwell, with Dylan sleeping on his shoulders, leaving Sophia standing in the hallway, with the ghost of a conversation that had revealed more about what Marcus was running from than any employment file could capture. Monday morning arrived with the weight of decisions that Sophia had been avoiding since Friday night's conversation with Marcus in the hallway. The tech wing opportunity sat in her email inbox like unexploded ordnance, Dr. Helen Zhao's follow-up inquiry asking whether Castellano Aviation's impressive pilot might be available for consultation on their new training simulator project. Sophia composed the invitation carefully, corporate formality, masking the personal investment she wasn't ready to acknowledge. Called Marcus to her office at 9:00 a.m., professional summons, that gave him no room to refuse without making his avoidance obvious. He arrived 10 minutes later, still wearing his gray maintenance uniform, exhaustion visible in the lines around his eyes, that suggested he'd been up all night, either working his shift or dealing with Dylan, or both. He stood in front of her desk with hands clasped, posture respectful but guarded, waiting for her to explain why the CEO needed to speak with a janitor during business hours. Sophia didn't waste time on pleasantries. TechWing wants to contract you directly for their pilot training simulator project. 6 months of consultation work, mostly remote, flexible hours so you could work around Dylan's schedule. $85,000 for the duration with possibility of permanent position afterward. She paused, watching Marcus's face for reaction that didn't come. There's also a scholarship program for employees' children that would cover private school tuition. Seattle Academy, it's where the executives send their kids. Dylan would have access to resources that public schools can't provide. Marcus was quiet for a long time, expression unchanged, processing information that should have been life-changing, but which he was apparently treating as just another problem requiring analysis. When he finally spoke, his voice carried none of the gratitude or excitement that Sophia had expected. "Why are you doing this?" The question felt like accusation rather than curiosity, challenging her motives in ways that made Sophia defensive, despite knowing that his skepticism was earned. She'd spent 18 months treating maintenance staff as invisible, had mocked him 3 days ago for claiming skills that turned out to be legitimate, and now she was offering opportunities that came with strings she hadn't quite articulated to herself. Her voice came out sharper than intended. "Because you're qualified. Because TechWing needs someone with your expertise. Because Dylan deserves better than what minimum wage can provide." Marcus's jaw tightened, the first crack in his careful neutrality. "With respect, Miss Castellano, you don't know what Dylan deserves. You don't know anything about our life or what's best for us." The words hit harder than they should have because they were true. Sophia knew nothing about Marcus Hayes beyond what military records and 3 days of observation had revealed, knew nothing about Dylan except that he drew helicopters and believed his father was a hero, knew nothing about their life beyond the surface details that suggested poverty and struggle and choices made from necessity rather than preference. "You're right, I don't know your situation, but I know that $85,000 would change what's possible for both of you. I know that Seattle Academy would give Dylan opportunities that—" No. The word was firm, final, carrying weight that suggested Marcus had made this decision before she'd finished her pitch. Sophia felt frustration rising, the same irritation she experienced in board meetings when people refused to see logic that seemed obvious to her. "You're not even going to consider it." Marcus's voice remained steady. "I appreciate the offer. I appreciate that you're trying to help. But no, I don't need recognition. I don't need visibility. I don't need title or career or any of the things that come with stepping back into being Captain Hayes." He paused, and when he continued, his voice carried conviction that came from having thought this through many times. "I need Dylan to be safe and happy. That's it. Not wealthy, not attending elite schools where rich kids will remind him every day that his father cleans their parents' offices. Just safe and happy with a father who's present instead of off consulting for companies that want to use my military experience for their profit margins." Sophia felt the accusation beneath his words, the implication that she was trying to exploit his background for business purposes rather than helping him out of genuine concern. The worst part was that she couldn't quite argue with that interpretation because she didn't fully understand her own motives beyond guilt and curiosity and growing recognition that Marcus Hayes was more interesting as a person than most of the executives she dealt with daily. "So you're going to keep mopping floors for $15.50 an hour when you could be making 6 figures doing work that actually uses your skills?" Marcus's expression finally showed emotion, flash of pain quickly suppressed but visible enough that Sophia knew she'd hit something raw. I'm going to keep being present for my son instead of being Captain Hayes who makes decisions that get people hurt. That's the choice I made 3 years ago, and it's the choice I'm making now. You're being proud to the point of self-destruction. I'm being protective. There's a difference. Sophia stood frustration, making her voice harsh in ways that her employees would recognize as dangerous territory. You want to know what I think? I think you're not protecting Dylan. You're protecting yourself from having to be the person who saved 6 soldiers under fire, from having to make decisions with lives on the line, from having to be brave instead of invisible. The words were cruel, and Sophia knew it even as they left her mouth. Professional boundary violation that would have consequences she couldn't predict. Marcus's face went carefully blank, the shutdown that happened when someone had been hit in the vulnerable place and was retreating behind walls that couldn't be penetrated by further attack. When he spoke, his voice was quiet and controlled, each word chosen with precision that suggested he was fighting to maintain composure. You don't know anything about what I'm protecting him from, Miss Castellano. You don't know what it's like to make split-second decisions where people die if you're wrong. You don't know what it's like to come home and find out that the person you loved most in the world is dead because you were 7,000 miles away doing your duty instead of being there to protect her. He took a breath. So yes, I'm protecting myself. I'm protecting myself from ever having to make those decisions again, from ever having to live with the knowledge that my choices destroyed someone else's life. And if that makes me a coward in your eyes, I can live with that judgment better than I can live with more blood on my hands. Then he turned and walked toward the door, movements controlled and deliberate, someone who was done with this conversation, and with the CEO who thought she understood struggles she'd never experienced. Sophia's voice stopped him at the threshold, words coming out before her pride could prevent them. I'm sorry, that was out of line. Marcus paused but didn't turn around. You were trying to help, I understand that. But the best help you can give me is letting me disappear back into being the janitor who doesn't matter enough to warrant your attention. He left, closing the door quietly behind him, and Sophia stood in her office feeling like she'd just lost negotiations she hadn't realized she was having. The TechWing opportunity still sat in her email, unanswered inquiry from Dr. Zhao asking whether consultation was possible, and Sophia had no idea how to respond beyond admitting that her pilot had refused because he'd rather mop floors than be Captain Hayes again. Dylan Hayes had learned early that school was performance requiring careful management of what you revealed about yourself. At 5 years old, attending Kennedy Elementary in South Seattle, he'd already mastered the art of being invisible, keeping his head down and his drawings private and his mouth shut about the parts of his life that would make the other kids laugh. He knew his family was poor, knew the apartment they lived in was smaller than most kids' bedrooms, knew his father worked at night cleaning buildings while other dads worked in offices doing important things that paid enough to buy new shoes instead of sewing patches onto old ones. But Dylan also knew something the other kids didn't know, secret he kept because his father had asked him to keep it, and because Dylan understood that some truths were too big to share with people who wouldn't understand their importance. His father was a hero. Dylan had found the evidence 2 months ago while looking for his favorite book in his father's closet. The box had been hidden behind old jackets and shoes that didn't fit any more cardboard container sealed with packing tape that Dylan had carefully peeled back before opening the lid. Inside was a uniform army green with patches and insignia that Dylan didn't understand but knew meant something important. There were medals, too heavy and serious-looking, arranged in a display case that someone had clearly assembled with care before hiding it away where nobody would see. One medal had a star, and when Dylan had turned it over, he'd found engraving, Captain Marcus Hayes, Medal of Valor, Kandahar Province, 2019. There was also a photograph, edges worn from handling, showing his father much younger, standing in front of a Black Hawk helicopter with other soldiers. They were all smiling like they owned the world, and his father looked different, not just younger, but lighter somehow, like he hadn't yet learned to carry the weight that Dylan saw in his eyes every morning. Dylan had been staring at the photograph when his father came home early from his shift, finding his 5-year-old son sitting on the bedroom floor, surrounded by evidence of a past that Marcus had been trying to hide. Marcus had gone very still, face doing that thing where it looked calm, but his eyes showed sadness that made Dylan's stomach hurt in ways he couldn't quite name. His father's voice had been quiet when he spoke. Where did you find this? Dylan had pointed to the closet knowing he was in trouble, but not quite understanding what kind of trouble or why his father looked more hurt than angry. In your closet. Dad, were you a soldier? The silence had stretched long enough that Dylan started worrying that his father wouldn't answer, that he'd broken some rule he didn't know existed, and the punishment would be losing access to truth he desperately wanted to understand. But finally, Marcus had knelt down, taken Dylan's hands in his own calloused ones, and said words that Dylan would remember for the rest of his life. I used to be, a long time ago, but I'm not anymore, and I need you to not tell anyone about this. Can you promise me that it's our secret? Dylan had nodded, confusion mixing with pride that his father trusted him with information that was clearly important. Why is it a secret? Marcus had looked at the photograph for a long time before answering, and when he did, his voice carried weight that suggested he was trying to explain something complex to someone too young to fully understand. Because sometimes people used to be things that hurt too much to remember. And the only way to stop hurting is to stop being that person. Do you understand? Dylan hadn't understood then. Still didn't really. 6 weeks later, sitting in Kennedy Elementary's cafeteria eating the peanut butter sandwich his father had packed, while other kids ate hot lunch that their parents could afford to pay for. But he'd kept the secret because his father had asked him to had stopped telling the other kids that his dad was the best pilot in the world, had learned to say he cleans buildings when kids asked what his father did for work. But keeping the secret didn't stop Dylan from knowing the truth. Didn't stop him from drawing helicopters in his notebook with his father as the pilot. Didn't stop him from believing that someday his father would fly again, because heroes didn't stay hidden forever, no matter how much they wanted to. That night, lying on the couch that served as his bed in their one-bedroom apartment, Dylan drew another helicopter. This one had 3 stick figures, his father in the pilot seat, Miss Sophia in the passenger seat, and Dylan himself in the back waving out the window. He labeled it carefully, "My Family," in letters he'd been practicing in kindergarten. The drawing was fiction wishful thinking from a 5-year-old who understood loneliness better than children his age should. But Dylan believed that if he drew it enough times, if he believed hard enough, maybe the universe would notice and make it real, because that's how magic worked in the stories his father read him before bed. Thursday night at 11:34 p.m. Sophia was still in her office reviewing quarterly projections when she heard crying, soft, broken sounds that carried through the executive floor's empty hallways. She stood and followed the noise to the simulation room, where Castellano Aviation tested flight training equipment, state-of-the-art virtual cockpits that replicated emergency procedures with disturbing accuracy. Dylan sat on the floor outside the simulation room, knees pulled to chest, tears streaming down his face with the abandon that came from being too exhausted to maintain control. Sophia's heart clenched at the sight maternal instincts she didn't know she possessed activating in response to a child's distress. She knelt beside him, voice gentle in ways her employees rarely heard. "Dylan, what's wrong? Where's your dad?" Dylan hiccuped through sobs, small body shaking. "He went inside, said he needed a minute, but he's been in there a long time and I had a bad dream." Sophia looked through the glass window of the simulation room and felt her breath catch. Marcus sat in one of the flight rigs, head in his hands, shoulders shaking with the kind of silent crying that came from grief so profound that sound couldn't contain it. She'd never seen him like this, never seen the careful control slip enough to reveal the devastation underneath. Dylan's voice was small when he spoke again. "I dreamed about Mommy, about her going away and not coming back. And then Dad goes away too and I'm alone forever." The words hit Sophia with force that made her throat close, because this 5-year-old child was carrying fear that no child should have to process, the terror that everyone you loved would disappear and leave you abandoned in a universe that didn't care about your need for stability. She sat down beside Dylan, unsure what to say, but knowing that silence was inadequate response to this kind of pain. "You're awake now, sweetheart. Can't have bad dreams when you're awake." Dylan shook his head, wisdom beyond his years, written in the tears that kept falling. "But I do. I dream about it all the time, even when I'm awake. About Mommy dying and Dad being gone and nobody staying." Sophia pulled Dylan into her lap without thinking about whether it was appropriate maternal instinct overriding professional boundaries that suddenly seemed absurd when confronted with a grieving child who needed comfort more than he needed CEO maintaining proper distance. Dylan buried his face in her shoulder, small body fitting against hers in ways that made Sophia realize how long it had been since she'd held anyone, how long since physical comfort had been part of her emotional vocabulary. She whispered words that surprised her with their honesty. I know it's scary. I know you miss her. But you're not alone, Dylan. You have your dad, and he loves you more than anything in the world. The simulation room door opened, and Marcus emerged, eyes red but face composed, the shutdown that happened when he'd been caught vulnerable and needed to rebuild walls that had temporarily collapsed. He saw Sophia holding his son and froze, expression shifting through confusion to something approaching pain. His voice was rough when he spoke. I'm sorry, I didn't know anyone was here. Sophia stood carefully, Dylan still clinging to her, small arms wrapped around her neck, with the desperate grip of someone who'd decided she was safety in a moment when safety was scarce. She looked at Marcus over Dylan's head and saw exhaustion that went deeper than physical tiredness, grief that had been compressed into manageable box but which had apparently broken free during whatever had happened in the simulation room. It's okay. We're okay. Right, Dylan. The boy nodded against her shoulder but didn't let go, and Marcus stood there watching his son find comfort in the arms of a woman he'd known for less than a week, with expression that suggested he didn't know whether to be grateful or concerned about the attachment forming. Marcus stepped closer, voice gentle. Come on, buddy. We should let Miss Castellano get back to work. But Dylan's arms tightened, small voice muffled against Sophia's shoulder. I don't want to go. I want to stay with Miss Sophia where it's safe. The words broke something in Marcus's carefully maintained composure. His face crumpled for just a moment before he got control back, but Sophia saw the devastation in his eyes, the recognition that his 5-year-old son didn't feel safe with him in this moment, that Dylan was seeking protection from someone else, because Marcus had just demonstrated that he wasn't stable enough to be the anchor his child needed. Sophia's voice was firm but gentle when she spoke to Dylan. Your dad is the safest person in the world, Dylan. He's a hero who saved 6 soldiers. He's never going to let anything bad happen to you. Dylan pulled back enough to look at her with tear-streaked face. But he's sad. And when he's sad, I get scared that the sadness will make him go away, like Mommy went away. The confession hit both adults with force that made the hallway feel smaller. Marcus's hands were shaking when he reached for his son, voice breaking, despite his attempt to maintain control. I'm not going anywhere, Dylan. I promise. The sadness doesn't mean I'm leaving. It just means I miss someone I loved, but I'm never going to leave you. Never. He took Dylan from Sophia's arms and held him close, and Sophia watched father and son cling to each other with the desperation that came from having already lost too much and being terrified of losing more. She should have left, should have given them privacy for a moment that clearly wasn't meant for witnesses. But Marcus spoke before she could retreat, words spilling out like confession he'd been holding back too long. I used to be in control, used to know exactly what to do, made decisions in combat that saved lives, and I was good at it, the best my unit had. But then I made one decision wrong and someone got hurt. My co-pilot during an extraction in Kandahar. He paused, Dylan's head resting against his shoulder, small body finally relaxing as Marcus's voice provided the stability he'd been seeking. We were pulling out a squad that had been pinned down for 6 hours, taking heavy fire. My co-pilot got hit shrapnel from an RPG that came through the cockpit. He was bleeding out, and I had to choose land immediately to save him or finish the extraction first. If I landed, the squad would have been overrun. If I finished the mission, he might die before we got back to base. Marcus's voice cracked. I chose the mission, pulled out all 6 soldiers, flew back with my co-pilot bleeding in the seat beside me. He lived but barely, 6 months in the hospital, permanent nerve damage in his left arm. Now he's in a desk job because he can't fly anymore. Sophia felt tears on her face, empathy she hadn't expected to feel for decisions she couldn't imagine having to make. Marcus continued, words flowing like poison he had been holding in too long. I got a medal. He got disability discharge. And I've been second-guessing every decision I've made since, because how do I know if I chose right? How do I know I didn't just sacrifice him because completing the mission was easier than living the guilt of losing those soldiers? Dylan stirred in his arms. But you saved them, Daddy. You saved everybody. Marcus's voice was barely whisper. Not everybody. Your mom died because I was overseas being a hero, instead of home protecting the person who mattered most. So I left the military because I couldn't trust myself anymore. Because if I'm nobody, I can't fail anyone else, can't make more decisions that get people hurt. Sophia understood suddenly why Marcus had refused her job offer, why he'd chosen invisibility over recognition, why he'd rather mop floors than be Captain Hayes. It wasn't cowardice, it wasn't pride. It was the calculated decision of someone who'd lost faith in his own judgment and decided that the safest path was removing himself from situations where his choices had consequences. Her voice was thick with emotion when she finally spoke. You didn't fail anyone, Marcus. You made impossible choice and saved 6 lives. Your co-pilot survived because you got him back to base instead of dying in a field. And Elena's death, she paused using his wife's name for the first time. That wasn't your fault. Drunk drivers don't ask permission before destroying lives. Marcus met her eyes, and for the first time since she'd met him, his walls were completely down. But I wasn't there. If I'd been home instead of deployed, maybe nothing would have changed except you'd have 2 deaths to carry instead of 1. You can't know, none of us can know what would have happened if we'd made different choices. All we can do is keep trying. Dylan's sleepy voice interrupted them. Mrs. Chen says brave people aren't people who aren't scared. Brave people are people who are scared but do the thing anyway. The wisdom of a 5-year-old quoting their elderly neighbor hit both adults with the kind of simple truth that felt profound because children hadn't yet learned to complicate obvious things. Marcus looked down at his son with expression that mixed love and pain and something that might have been hope, trying to break through layers of grief and guilt. Mrs. Chen is a smart lady. So maybe you could be brave again? Dylan suggested, voice fading as exhaustion claimed him. Because I think you forgot you're brave, but it's still there inside. Victor Castellano arrived at Sophia's office Tuesday morning without warning, walking through her door at 8:47 a.m. with expression that suggested he'd been awake most of the night, working himself into the kind of righteous anger that fathers felt when they believed their daughters were making catastrophic mistakes. 72 years old and still built like the Navy pilot he'd been in Vietnam, Victor commanded space through sheer presence that made younger executives nervous. He'd semi-retired 18 months ago but maintained enough board influence to make Sophia's life complicated whenever he disagreed with her decisions. And judging by the folder he slammed on her desk, he disagreed significantly with recent events. His voice carried the particular tone of controlled fury that Sophia remembered from childhood when she disappointed him by failing to meet standards he'd set. We need to talk about the janitor. Sophia looked up from her laptop, stomach sinking, because she'd known this confrontation was coming, but had hoped to delay it longer. His name is Marcus Hayes. I don't care what his name is. You let some nobody fly our helicopter. You're spending time with him and his kid. Richard Brennan has been calling me asking if you're losing focus. The mention of Richard Brennan, senior board member, who'd been waiting for Sophia to make mistake justifying her removal, made her jaw tighten with frustration that her father was letting himself be manipulated by people who wanted her to fail. I made a business decision. We needed transportation. Marcus was qualified. The flight was perfect, and we secured the tech wing contract. That's the entire story. Victor's voice rose slightly. That's not the entire story, and you know it. I know you've been investigating him. I know you found out he's decorated war hero. And I know you've been watching him with his son like you're playing house with the help. The accusation was unfair and insulting and close enough to truth that Sophia felt defensive anger rising to match her father's. How dare you suggest? How dare I? Victor leaned forward, voice dropping to dangerous quiet. I built this company from nothing, built this legacy, and I will not watch you throw it away for some broken soldier who mops floors because he can't handle being what he used to be. The words landed like physical blow, each one designed to hurt and diminish and establish exactly what Victor thought of Marcus Hayes, regardless of his military record or his competence or his humanity. Sophia stood voice cold with fury she was barely controlling. Marcus Hayes is not broken. He's a Medal of Valor recipient who pulled 6 soldiers out of enemy fire. He's raising a son alone after losing his pregnant wife. He flew me across this city with expertise that most professional pilots couldn't match. He's the most whole person I've ever met, and if you can't see that, then maybe you're the one who's broken. Victor stared at his daughter like she'd spoken in foreign language. In 18 months as CEO, Sophia had defended her decisions, but she'd never challenged his judgment directly, never suggested that his perspective might be flawed or his values questionable. "You're making a mistake." Sophia's voice didn't waver. "Then I'll make it. And if you can't accept that, if the board can't accept that I make decisions based on competence rather than social status, then I'll resign. I'll announce it at Friday's board meeting. You can install Richard as CEO. He'll run this company exactly the way you think it should be, run safe, conservative, never taking risks on people who don't fit narrow definitions of deserving." She paused, letting the threat sink in. "But you'll lose the tech wing contract I just signed. You'll lose the expansion into training systems that will double our revenue. And you'll lose the knowledge that your daughter was willing to sacrifice everything rather than compromise her principles." The room fell silent, except for the ambient noise of the city 42 floors below. Victor's face worked through emotions that Sophia rarely saw him display: anger giving way to confusion, giving way to something that might have been grudging respect for daughter, who just proven she had his stubbornness, even if she didn't share his prejudices. Finally, he turned toward the door, movement stiff with anger he was struggling to contain. He paused with his hand on the handle, not looking back when he spoke. "Your mother would have made the same choice. She always did have terrible judgment about people who needed saving." And then he left, and Sophia stood in her office, trembling with adrenaline and the terrifying realization that she just bet her entire career on defending someone who'd explicitly told her he didn't want to be saved. The email from TechWing Aviation arrived Wednesday evening at 6:47 p.m. direct from Dr. Helen Zhao's office, bypassing Sophia entirely to reach Marcus through the company directory that listed every employee regardless of their position. Someone at TechWing had done research, found the janitor who'd flown their CEO with such professional precision, and decided to make an offer that couldn't be ignored. Marcus stared at his phone screen in the Castellano Aviation break room, Dylan asleep on the bench beside him with his notebook of helicopter drawings clutched against his chest. The message was formal but direct, carrying the weight of opportunity that could transform their lives if Marcus was willing to step back into being Captain Hayes instead of remaining invisible. Subject: direct consultation offer. Flight demonstration. "Mr. Hayes, we understand from reliable sources that you possess rare combination of military combat aviation and civilian aircraft expertise. TechWing Aviation is hosting our annual Global Aviation Summit in 6 weeks at Boeing Field, showcasing next-generation pilot training systems to 500-plus international investors and partners. We would like to contract you directly for a live flight demonstration, precision flying, that showcases the kind of skills our training systems are designed to develop. This is not symbolic gesture. This is recognition of expertise we need and are willing to compensate fairly. Compensation package: $50,000 for the demonstration. Single day, approximately 2 hours flight time. Full scholarship for your son at Seattle Academy, valued at $35,000 annually through high school graduation. Potential ongoing consultation contract if demonstration meets expectations. This offer stands independent of your current employment. We're not asking you to leave Castellano Aviation. We're asking you to fly one demonstration that could secure your son's educational future. Please respond within 48 hours. Respectfully, Dr. Helen Zhao, Chief Operating Officer, TechWing Aviation." Marcus read the email 3 times each pass, revealing new implications that made his chest tighten with anxiety that had nothing to do with flying and everything to do with visibility. $50,000, Dylan's education guaranteed through high school. The kind of financial security that would mean Marcus could stop working 3 imaginary jobs. He only worked 1, but it felt like 3, given the hours, and actually be present for his son's childhood instead of perpetually exhausted. But accepting meant standing in front of 500 people and being Captain Hayes again. Meant answering questions about his background and his service, and why someone with Medal of Valor was working as janitor instead of flying for commercial carriers. Meant risking the quiet anonymity that had protected him from having to explain why he'd walked away from everything that used to define him. Dylan stirred on the bench, eyes fluttering open with the disoriented confusion that came from waking in unfamiliar places. He looked around the break room until he found Marcus, then smiled with the relief that suggested he'd been worried about waking up alone. "Dad, what time is it?" Marcus set down his phone. Almost 7. We should head home soon so you can sleep in an actual bed. Dylan sat up, rubbing his eyes. Were you reading something important? You look worried. The observation was accurate because 5-year-olds were better at reading adult emotions than adults gave them credit for. Marcus hesitated, trying to decide whether to share information that Dylan wouldn't fully understand or maintain the fiction that everything was simple and manageable. He chose honesty because lying to his son felt wrong even when truth was complicated. Someone wants to hire me to fly a helicopter with them. They'll pay a lot of money and give you a scholarship to a really good school. Dylan's face lit up with excitement that made Marcus's chest ache. Really, you're going to fly again? I don't know yet. It's complicated. Dylan climbed off the bench and stood in front of Marcus with expression that was suddenly serious beyond his years. Is it because you're scared? The question hit like punch to chest because children had gift for identifying truths that adults spent years avoiding. Marcus wanted to deny it, to explain that his refusal had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with protecting Dylan from instability that came from Marcus being visible instead of invisible. But Dylan deserved honesty more than he deserved comfortable lies. Maybe, yes, I'm scared of being that person again. Scared of making decisions where people get hurt if I'm wrong. Scared of, he paused, trying to find words that a 5-year-old could understand. Scared of forgetting how to just be your dad because I'm too busy being Captain Hayes. Dylan put a small hand on Marcus's arm with gentleness that seemed impossibly mature. Mrs. Chen says brave people aren't people who aren't scared. Brave people are people who are scared but do the thing anyway. The wisdom had more impact coming from Dylan than it would have from any adult, because Marcus couldn't dismiss his son's insight the way he could dismiss advice from people who didn't understand what he was protecting. Mrs. Chen is very wise. So maybe you could be brave. Dylan's voice carried hope that made Marcus's throat tighten. Because you're always telling me to be brave when I'm scared, like when I have to go to new places or try new things. You say being scared is okay, but hiding from scary things makes them bigger. Marcus pulled Dylan into his lap, holding him close while processing the fact that his 5-year-old son had just given him advice using Marcus's own parenting philosophy reflected back at him. Out of mouths of babes came uncomfortable truths about how his choices were teaching Dylan that hiding from fear was acceptable when Marcus had spent years insisting that courage meant facing what scared you. What do you think I should do? Dylan didn't hesitate. I think you should fly, because you're the best pilot in the world and the best pilots aren't supposed to hide. And also because I want to go to the good school where they have a library with actual books instead of just the broken ones. The practical consideration made Marcus laugh despite the anxiety coiling in his stomach. You make a compelling argument, buddy. Is that a yes? Marcus looked at his son's hopeful face and felt something shift in his chest, the weight of 3 years of hiding, beginning to crack under pressure from a child who believed his father was hero and who deserved better than what minimum wage could provide. It's a maybe. I need to think about it. Dylan smiled like maybe was good enough for now, then yawned with the jaw-cracking intensity that signaled exhaustion had won over his desire to stay awake. Marcus stood lifting Dylan onto his shoulders with practiced ease and walked toward the stairwell that would take them down to the parking lot where his truck waited. But instead of descending, Marcus found himself climbing upward, taking the stairs to the 42nd floor, where Sophia's office lights still glowed despite the late hour. He told himself he was just checking to see if she was working late again, that this wasn't seeking her opinion because her opinion shouldn't matter when the decision was his alone to make. The rationalization fell apart when he knocked on her office door and heard her voice call for him to enter. Sophia looked up from quarterly reports she'd been reviewing, with diminishing comprehension, her brain too occupied with replaying her father's visit and the ultimatum she'd delivered, and the question of whether she'd just sacrificed her career for a janitor who didn't want to be saved. Marcus stood in her doorway with Dylan asleep on his shoulders, and something about the image, exhausted father carrying sleeping child at 7 p.m. while presumably about to start his cleaning shift, made Sophia's chest tighten with emotion she didn't want to name. I got an email from TechWing. Marcus's voice was quiet, careful not to wake Dylan. They want to hire me directly for their aviation summit. $50,000 for a flight demonstration, plus scholarship for Dylan. Sophia's heart rate accelerated with hope she tried to suppress because hoping meant caring. and caring meant vulnerability she'd spent 3 years avoiding. That's wonderful. Are you going to accept? Marcus's expression was unreadable. I don't know. That's why I'm here. Dylan says I should do it. Mrs. Chen apparently says brave people do scary things anyway. But I don't know if I'm ready to be Captain Hayes in front of 500 people who'll have questions I don't want to answer. He paused. What do you think I should do? The question felt like test that Sophia wasn't sure how to pass because the wrong answer might push Marcus further into hiding, while the right answer might sound like she was trying to manipulate him into decisions that served her guilt more than his well-being. She chose honesty because anything else felt like betrayal of whatever fragile connection they'd been building through awkward conversations and shared moments with Dylan. I think you should do what's best for Dylan. And I think what's best for Dylan is having a father who's present and stable and able to provide opportunities that minimum wage can't offer. But I also think she paused, gathering courage for confession she hadn't planned to make. I also think Dylan needs a father who models courage instead of hiding, who shows him that being scared is okay, but letting fear make your decisions isn't. Marcus's jaw tightened. You're saying I'm teaching him to be a coward. I'm saying you're teaching him that the appropriate response to trauma is disappearing instead of healing. And maybe that works for you, but when Dylan faces his own trauma someday, and he will because life guarantees pain for everyone, he's going to remember that his father chose invisibility over recovery. The words were harsh, but Sophia couldn't soften them because Marcus needed to hear truth that nobody else was apparently willing to speak. He stood there processing Dylan's weight on his shoulders, face showing internal struggle between what he wanted to believe and what he feared might be accurate. Finally, he spoke, voice rough with emotion he was fighting to contain. What if I fail? What if I get up there in front of all those people and I freeze? What if the PTSD kicks in and I can't fly or I make mistakes that prove I don't deserve their respect? Sophia stood and walked around her desk until she was close enough to see the fear in Marcus's eyes that his careful control couldn't quite hide. Then you fail in front of 500 people and you survive it, and then you try again. That's what recovery looks like, not perfection, just willingness to keep trying even when trying is terrifying. Will you be there? The question came out vulnerable, stripped of the defensive pride that usually colored Marcus's interactions with her. At the demonstration, I know it's asking a lot, but I don't think I can do this unless I know someone's there who won't judge me if I'll be there. Sophia's voice was firm, certain in ways that surprised her. Every second. I'll be on the ground with headset, talking you through it if you need me to. And if you crash the helicopter, I'll be the first person to tell the press it was equipment failure instead of pilot error. Marcus's smile was small but genuine, the first real smile she'd seen from him that wasn't directed at Dylan. That's highly unethical. Then I guess I'm learning to be unethical when it matters. The next 6 weeks passed in preparation that consumed Marcus's limited free time and Sophia's previously unlimited work hours. TechWing sent specifications for the demonstration flight, precision maneuvers, emergency procedures, the kind of flying that required practice to execute flawlessly, even for pilots with Marcus's experience. Sophia arranged for Marcus to use Castellano Aviation's Bell 407 during off-hours late-night practice sessions when the building was empty and nobody would ask questions about why the janitor was flying the company helicopter. She acted as ground support, learning radio protocols and emergency procedures so she could fulfill her promise to talk him through the demonstration if his confidence failed. The first practice flight was disaster that nearly ended the entire plan. Marcus climbed into the pilot's seat at 11:47 p.m. with confidence that lasted until he started the engine and the rotor noise triggered memories that had been dormant for 3 years. Sophia watched through her headset as his hands started shaking, breath coming in short gasps that suggested panic attack rather than pre-flight jitters. His voice came through the radio strained and barely controlled. I can't do this. It's the same sound from Kandahar when the RPG came through and Jackson was bleeding and I had to choose. Marcus, look at me. Sophia's voice was firm, cutting through the panic with authority that came from watching her father talk pilots through emergency landings when she was a teenager, learning the aviation business. You're not in Kandahar. You're at Seattle. The year is 23 and you're safe, and Dylan is safe, and nobody is shooting at you. Marcus's breathing slowed slightly, but his hands remained locked on the controls, frozen by memories that were more real in this moment than the present. Sophia continued, voice steady and calm, and carrying conviction she didn't quite feel. In through your nose for 4 counts. Hold for 4. Out through your mouth for 4. Do it with me now. In, 2, 3, 4. Hold. 2, 3, 4. Out. 2, 3, 4. The breathing technique was basic, something any therapist would recommend for managing anxiety, but Sophia delivered it with the same confidence Marcus had used when telling her to breathe during their first flight together. She kept her voice steady for 15 minutes, while Marcus's panic gradually subsided enough that he could power down the helicopter and climb out on shaking legs. He stood on the rooftop, looking defeated in ways that made Sophia's chest ache. I can't do this. I thought I could, but I can't. The PTSD is too strong, and I'm not Captain Hayes anymore. I'm just broken version who can't even start an engine without falling apart. Sophia walked to him and did something she'd never done before, took his hand in hers, physical contact that crossed boundaries she'd been carefully maintaining. You're not broken. You're healing, and healing isn't linear. Sometimes you take steps backward before you can move forward. The demonstration is in 5 weeks. I don't have time to heal. Then we practice until the panic becomes manageable instead of overwhelming. Every night, as many times as it takes. And if you can't do the demonstration, we tell TechWing the truth and find another solution. Marcus looked at their joined hands with expression that suggested he wasn't sure whether to pull away or hold tighter. Why are you doing this? Why do you care so much about whether I fly again? The question deserved honesty, even if honesty revealed more than Sophia was comfortable admitting. Because I spent 18 months building walls to protect myself from getting hurt. And then you flew me across Seattle and showed me that the bravest thing you can do isn't protecting yourself, it's showing up for people, even when showing up terrifies you. I want to help you do the same thing. I'm not brave, Sophia. I'm terrified every day that I'm going to make wrong decision, and Dylan will pay the price. Being terrified and showing up anyway is literally the definition of courage. They practiced 4 nights every week for 5 weeks. Each session started with panic that Marcus learned to breathe through, with Sophia's voice grounding him when memories threatened to overwhelm present reality. Gradually, the panic attacks became less severe, the breathing techniques more effective, the time between starting the engine and achieving functional control shortening from 15 minutes to 5 to eventually almost none. Dylan attended some practices sitting in the passenger seat, drawing pictures, while his father flew circles over Seattle with Sophia's voice in his ear, providing encouragement and technical feedback. The boy's presence helped more than any breathing technique because Marcus couldn't fall apart in front of his son without teaching Dylan that fear was insurmountable. By week 4, Marcus was flying with something approaching his old competence. By week 5, he was executing the demonstration maneuvers with precision that would have impressed professional pilots. And by the night before the demonstration, he was ready, still scared, still carrying trauma that hadn't disappeared just because he'd practiced through it, but functional despite the fear. The morning of TechWing's Global Aviation Summit arrived with perfect October weather that pilots prayed for, and event planners paid premium prices to insurance companies hoping to guarantee. Clear skies, light winds, visibility unlimited across Puget Sound, where 500 aviation industry professionals had gathered at Boeing Field to watch demonstrations of technology they might purchase for their own training programs. Marcus stood beside the Bell 407 at 9:34 a.m., wearing flight suit that TechWing had provided professional attire that made him look like Captain Hayes instead of Janitor Marcus. His hands were steady despite the anxiety coiling in his stomach, 5 weeks of practice having trained his body to perform even when his mind was screaming that this was a terrible idea. Dylan stood beside him wearing miniature aviator sunglasses that Sophia had bought him the previous week, small face showing pride that made Marcus's throat tighten. The boy looked up at his father with absolute confidence that suggested he'd never doubted this moment would arrive. You're going to be awesome, Dad. Everyone's going to see you're the best pilot in the world. Marcus knelt down, adjusting Dylan's sunglasses with hands that only trembled slightly. What if I'm not awesome? What if I mess up? Dylan's answer came with the straightforward logic that children applied to adult anxieties. Then you'll still be my dad, and I'll still love you. Being awesome is just extra. The words hit Marcus with force that made him pull Dylan into tight hug this 5-year-old who'd somehow learned to give his father permission to be imperfect while still believing in his competence. When Marcus stood, Sophia was there with headset in hand, an expression that mixed concern with confidence, that felt unearned but welcome. Ready, Captain Hayes? The title felt foreign after 3 years of being nobody, but Marcus nodded because ready or not, 500 people were watching, and Dylan deserved to see his father be brave instead of hiding. As ready as I'll ever be. He climbed into the pilot seat, and Sophia's voice came through the headset with steady calm that had become familiar over 5 weeks of practice sessions. Remember, if the panic starts, just breathe with me. 4 and 4, hold 4 out. I'm right here. The engine roared to life, and Marcus felt the familiar spike of anxiety that came with rotor noise and aviation fuel and memories that would probably never fully fade. But Sophia's breathing cadence came through the headset, and Dylan was watching from the sideline, and 5 weeks of practice had taught Marcus that he could function despite fear if he had people anchoring him to present instead of letting him drown in past. The helicopter lifted off with smooth precision that came from muscle memory overriding conscious thought. Marcus executed the demonstration's sequence precision turns, altitude changes, emergency procedure simulations with the kind of flying that looked effortless because every micro adjustment was correct even when his hands were shaking and his breath was coming too fast. Sophia's voice provided constant anchor through the headset, not with technical instruction, because Marcus didn't need that, but with presence that reminded him he wasn't alone in the cockpit, even though the seat beside him was empty. She counted his breathing when panic threatened, confirmed his altitude when doubt crept in, reminded him that Dylan was watching when the trauma tried to convince him that Kandahar was more real than Seattle. The demonstration lasted 18 minutes. When Marcus landed with touchdown so gentle it didn't disturb the coffee cup in the center console, deliberate callback to the flight that had started everything, the crowd of 500 aviation professionals erupted in applause that sounded like thunder. Marcus sat in the pilot seat for a moment longer than necessary, hands still on controls, processing the fact that he'd just flown in front of 500 people without crashing or freezing or proving that he didn't deserve their respect. The panic had been there riding beneath every maneuver, but he'd functioned despite it in ways that suggested maybe healing was possible, even if trauma never fully disappeared. He climbed out of the cockpit, and Dylan ran to him, launching himself into Marcus's arms with the kind of joyful abandon that only children could manage. The boy was practically vibrating with excitement. That was so cool. You did all the tricks, and you didn't crash, and everyone was clapping. Did you hear them clapping? They were clapping for you. Marcus held his son tight, and for the first time in 3 years, he smiled genuinely. Not the small, careful smiles he gave Dylan to maintain normalcy, but real smile that reached his eyes and felt like maybe he was remembering how to be happy instead of just surviving. Dr. Helen Zhao approached with expression that mixed professional satisfaction with genuine appreciation. Captain Hayes, that was extraordinary. If you're interested in ongoing consultation work, we'd like to discuss a long-term contract. Marcus looked at Sophia, who was standing nearby with headset still in her hand and tears streaming down her face that she wasn't bothering to hide. She nodded encouragement, and Marcus turned back to Dr. Zhao with answer that felt terrifying and liberating simultaneously. I'd like that, but I need flexibility for my son. He's the priority. We can work with that. Family always comes first. That evening, Sophia returned to her waterfront condo to find envelopes slipped under her door. Inside was handwritten note from her father on Castellano aviation letterhead, Victor's precise script carrying weight that typed words couldn't convey. Sophia, I watched the tech wing demonstration from the VIP section. Saw your janitor, Captain Hayes, fly with precision that most commercial pilots couldn't match. Saw you on the ground with headset, talking him through it like you were his co-pilot instead of his CEO. You were right, and I was wrong. Any man who would risk psychological breakdown in front of 500 people because his 5-year-old son asked him to be brave deserves more respect than I gave him. I'm proud of you for seeing what I couldn't see. Your mother would be proud too. Also, Richard Brennan has withdrawn his concerns about your leadership. Apparently, even he was impressed by the demonstration and your role in making it possible. Dad Sophia sat on her couch holding the note and crying for the second time that day, this time with relief that came from understanding that her gamble had paid off and her career had survived her choice to defend someone who'd needed defending even when he claimed he didn't. 2 weeks later, Marcus used the scholarship fund to enroll Dylan at Seattle Academy. But he didn't stop there. He'd accepted TechWing's consultation contract at $40,000 annually, plus benefits enough that he could quit the janitorial position and actually be present for Dylan's childhood instead of perpetually exhausted from night shifts that paid minimum wage. He started working with a nonprofit that provided free flight training to underprivileged teenagers, using his expertise to create opportunities for kids who loved aviation but couldn't afford the barrier to entry that kept flying exclusive to wealthy families. Sophia quietly donated funding to keep the program running, and Marcus found out anyway because apparently wealthy CEOs weren't as subtle as they thought when their donations arrived the same week that budget shortfalls would have shut down operations. Dylan brought home a school assignment 3 weeks into his first semester at Seattle Academy. The prompt was, write about your hero, and Dylan's essay was 4 pages long, written in careful letters that showed he was taking the assignment seriously. My hero is my dad because he was scared to fly, but he did it anyway because being brave means doing things even when they're scary. But my other hero is Miss Sophia because she helped my dad remember that he's a pilot, and also she makes him smile in ways that are different from how he smiles at me. I think she makes him happy, and I think that's important because Dad deserves to be happy again. Marcus read it sitting at their new kitchen table in the two-bedroom apartment they could finally afford and carefully folded the paper before putting it in his wallet alongside the photograph from Kandahar and the hospital bracelet Dylan had worn in the NICU. That Saturday afternoon, Sophia went to the Castellano Aviation rooftop without quite knowing why. Nostalgia, maybe? Or the need to stand in the place where everything had started and process how much had changed in 8 weeks since a janitor had volunteered to fly and a CEO had made cruel joke about marriage. She found Marcus there cleaning the helicopter like he used to clean floors, old habits dying hard, even though he wasn't technically maintenance staff anymore. The sight made her smile. A hero with consultation contract worth $60,000 annually still couldn't resist the urge to make sure aircraft were properly maintained. He looked up when he heard her approach, smile automatic now, instead of the careful performance it had been. Caught me. I keep telling myself I don't have to do this anymore, but then I come up here and can't help myself. Sophia walked closer. You know I never actually meant what I said that morning, about marrying you if you flew the helicopter. Marcus set down his cleaning cloth expression, shifting to something more serious. I know. It was mockery. I understood that. But what if... Sophia paused, gathering courage for confession that felt more terrifying than any board meeting she'd ever faced. What if I meant it now? The question hung in the October air between them, sunlight catching in Marcus's eyes as he processed what she was asking. His voice was careful when he responded, testing to make sure he'd understood correctly. Are you saying what I think you're saying? Sophia's heart was racing, but her voice came out steady. I'm saying that over the past 8 weeks, I've watched you be brave when bravery meant falling apart and trying again. I've watched you love your son with devotion that puts my career obsession to shame. I've watched you fight through trauma that would destroy most people. And somewhere in all that watching, I realized I don't want to just watch anymore. I want to be part of your life instead of observer from a distance. Marcus stepped closer, close enough that she could see the exact moment when hope replaced skepticism in his expression. I'm a mess, Sophia. I've got PTSD and a 5-year-old, and I'm still figuring out how to be Captain Hayes without being the version who makes decisions that get people hurt. Are you sure you want to sign up for that? I've never been more sure of anything. The sun was setting over Seattle, painting the sky in golds and pinks that made the city look almost magical. Marcus knelt down on one knee on the rooftop where everything had started, pulling from his pocket a simple silver ring engraved with 2 small wings that he'd apparently been carrying around waiting for right moment. I used to fly for my country, thought that was the most important thing I'd ever do. But then I had Dylan, and I learned that flying for someone you love matters more than flying for abstract concepts like duty or honor. He paused. Now I want to fly for 2 people, you and Dylan, if you'll have me. Not because I owe you anything or because you saved me, but because you helped me remember that being scared and showing up anyway is what courage actually looks like. Will you marry me? Sophia's vision blurred with tears she didn't try to hide. Yes, Dylan appeared from behind a ventilation unit where he'd apparently been hiding with a bouquet of flowers that were slightly crushed from being clutched too tight. He ran toward them, shouting with five-year-old volume control. "Does this mean she's staying forever?" Sophia laughed through tears, catching Dylan as he launched himself at her. "Forever, boy," the boy cheered. "Dad, you did it. You flew and you got married, and now we're a real family." They stood together on the rooftop as the sun set over Seattle, three people who'd found each other through combination of wrong number, that was right number, and cruel mockery, that became genuine love, an invisible janitor who turned out to be exactly the hero everyone needed even when he couldn't see it in himself. Somewhere below, the city continued its endless motion, indifferent to individual stories of redemption and courage and healing. But up on the rooftop, where a CEO had once mocked a janitor's claim that he could fly, Marcus Hayes held his son and his future wife and understood that the bravest thing he'd ever done wasn't pulling six soldiers from enemy fire. It was letting people see him broken and trusting that they'd still think he was worth loving.